as Gordon has foreshadowed, I am going to be speaking about the role of approving committees, because I have the pleasure to be on an ethics committee, the Health Research Council Ethics Committee in Aotearoa, that does exactly this. So we do not typically review research, we instead review committees. And I have to mention at this point my colleague, Lana Lon, who is the person who, well, I'm the chair of this committee, but she is the boss of this committee. She's the secretariat and she runs it. She knows what we're supposed to be doing and she keeps us on track. So I think Lana may be here with us today. And I want to invite you, Lana, at any point, if I lead people astray, please do put us right. There's the chat, and we don't want to be messing anything up here. So the way I see it, when researchers apply for ethics approval from a committee, that whole process is a way of that researchers hold themselves accountable and that society holds researchers accountable for what they do. So it's a process that is interested in answerability and accountability. And of course, wrapped into that is the concern around participant safety and protection of rights. But fundamentally, that whole process is about ensuring that what is done is regulated and safe and adheres to our community standards. So researchers do that. And then there's the question about, what about the ethics committees? Do they do that? Do they have to hold themselves accountable? And if so, who do they hold themselves accountable to? Well, in New Zealand, it's come to pass that almost all ethics committees, both based within universities and the health and disability ethics committees that are run out of the Ministry of Health, they hold themselves accountable to the HRC Ethics Committee. And I guess this raises the question about who we are accountable to. So we are a committee that approves the committees that approve research. So we can end up in this kind of endless feedback loop of accountability. And what I want to do in this session is to probe this, to ask how should we hold ethics committees that review research accountable, and what of the accountability of groups like mine? How do I know if I'm doing a good job? And I ask this question in a very open way. I'm trying to use this plenary as a way of holding my own committee accountable. But as I do that, I am aware that I sit within power relations, just like we all do. And it may be difficult for the people who are here, who know the most about how we operate, so who work with committees that we approve, to speak. But I hope that you will be able to speak and join this important conversation, because this is tricky material for all of us. And it was ever thus. So I'm going to begin where any good philosopher should begin, which is, of course, in ancient Greece. And, you know, questions of accountability, who's accountable to whom, are not new. They are an enduring challenge. So this photo here is an image of a space that's called the Pinks, which was the assembly point in Athens. So this is kind of 5th century Athens, when there was an early burgeoning democracy, and everybody, well, as long as you were a man and not a slave, got to have a role in the life of the polis. And there were a whole lot of complex mechanisms by which the people who were wielding power and responsibility were held accountable to the demos, to the people. And as an example of this, magistrates, the kind of role of a magistrate, there were maybe 700 magistrates at any given time in Athens, and they had a lot of responsibility for administering day-to-day affairs in Greece. And the way that the magistrates were chosen was by lot. So your name was called, and then you appeared before the assembly, and you had to make an account of yourself and present yourself for others to question and decide whether you were a fit person for office. And if you got through that process, at the end of your tenure as a magistrate, you would have to account for what you did. So you would have to account for your financial propriety and for any other issues of conduct. And if you were found wanting, you could be charged with a criminal offence, and you would have to appear before a jury of your peers. So the only bodies who really weren't accountable to somebody else in Athens were the bodies of the polis, so the juries and the assembly. They could make decisions that they were not held accountable for. And the question about this, the possibility that people could exercise irresponsible power, that was a really big preoccupation in ancient Greece. And if any of you have read the classics like Aristophanes, for instance, who wrote plays like The Wasp, they were really probing these questions about the risks of irresponsible power. What happens when you have power that you don't have to account for how you use it? Is it possible that even though the body might not be a tyrant, but they might be a democratically elected group or a jury, is it possible that they could fall prey to the same temptations that tyrants have to abuse their power? So these questions are not new, but that does not mean that we have sussed them. So these very clean-cut and impressive-looking specimens you might recognise as the current contingent of Supreme Court justices. And I have been watching, as I'm sure many of you have been, events over the last few years as the financial dealings, conflicts of interest, I think we could say, that some members of this court have become embroiled in have been disclosed, and the financial relationships that some of these justices have got themselves into give real pause for thought and cause to doubt whether this body, who has always held themselves above policing, are really or should be above any accountability. Because, and I think that this was a surprise to many people as the revelations came out, the Supreme Court did not have a code of ethics, and they didn't have any ways in which they could be held accountable, not by politicians, not by other judges, not by other bodies. So some of you may have seen that in November, the court has deigned to release a code of conduct that it holds itself to. But there's been no word about the processes by which this code will be adhered to, who will do the adherence. It seems to be that the plan is for self-policing. And I think we can ask questions about that. But of course, we can end up in this endless feedback loop of accountability. So, of course, I wasn't brought here to talk about ancient Greece or the Supreme Court, and Gordon might be relieved to know that I'm now moving on. So, ethics committees, just like the Supreme Court, just like various bodies in ancient Greece, have power. Ethics committees can determine whether a particular piece of research goes ahead. They can place limitations, restrictions, requirements on research. And when an ethics committee approves a piece of research, that approval carries an authority. It is reassuring to potential participants. It signifies that that research has passed a given ethical threshold. And for many potential participants, that reassurance will be instrumental, maybe even determinative of their willingness to trust and participate in research. So ethics committees have a very central role to play, and they do wield power, although I'm sure that ethics committees don't experience it like this, because this is not power for its own sake. It's not power that personally enriches you. It's a power that I think sits very heavily on many ethics committees, because it's a power that's given in the service of a responsibility. And I think that it's the responsibility that occupies committees and their members. How do we know that we are doing a good enough job? It's a responsibility that is one of service to the people. And I know the committees that I am involved with take that responsibility very seriously and use their power to ensure that research that's done via their committee reaches an ethical standard. And of course, that it's often the case that committees have to make very finely tuned and difficult decisions to get to their point of approving research. So we all know that ethics is a contested area. And when ethics committees approve research, they'll be making decisions that some other people, be they potential participants, be they other committees, be they even members of that committee, are uncomfortable with or disagree with. So committees cannot but get involved in the contestation of ethical ideas. That's the key role of an ethics committee, is to get involved in that, and not just get involved in it, but to reach a decision. So committees spend a lot of time in wrestling with these ideas about where is the line, about trying to identify ethical issues. So disagreement is not a problem in an ethics committee. It's a good thing. In a way, the trouble comes when there's no disagreement, when there are situations in which committee members feel either complacent, willing to trust the judgment of other committee members, or maybe they feel concerned about sharing their opinion of a particular piece of research because of the power dynamics that exist in that committee. And those were the kinds of dynamics that led to the case that really was sort of foundational, was part of the whakapapa of my committee. And that is a case that many of you, particularly if you're based in New Zealand, like I am, will be familiar with. And it's known here as the unfortunate experiment at National Women's Hospital. So I won't labor all the details of this because I'm sure many of you will be familiar with it. But I wanted to just speak briefly about the processes that led to that unfortunate experiment being formalized. Because I was lucky enough some years ago to have a discussion with a man who was on the original committees that we might say approved this research, although the processes were much less formal than that. These were two committees that were based in National Women's Hospital. And the person I spoke with was not a very junior, but a junior-ish member of these two hospital committees. I think that the committees had the same membership, but they were formally separate. One of them was called something like the Senior Medical Committee, and the other one was the National Women's Hospital Committee. And in 1966, the doctor who was leading the unfortunate experiment took his proposal to these committees. And the notes, the minutes of these meetings were part of the evidence that came before the Cartwright inquiry when it came about. So back in 1966, Dr. Green, who was an obstetrician and a gynecologist, he had a theory about cervical carcinoma in situ. So he believed that generally these were abnormal cells that were never going to become an invasive cancer. So his belief was that women were being overtreated for something that was never going to cause them harm, and some of them were losing their fertility or having invasive treatments that really were not necessary. So he wanted to prove his theory by taking a kind of observational approach to cancers. So in these proposals he brought before these two hospital committees, he suggested that all of the new patients who were brought to the hospital with abnormal cells should be referred to him, and he would review their progress. He would give them regular smear tests and determine whether or not they went on to develop invasive cancer. So these committees considered the matter and they recommended that Dr. Green proceed. So I think that the wording was something like that they agreed to recommend this study to their peers within the hospital. Now, the person I spoke with was really uncomfortable about this proposal, but Dr. Green was a powerful man. He was powerful both formally and he had a big personality, and he was best mates with Dr. Bonham, who was the chair of the National Women's Hospital Committee. And this person I spoke with felt silenced by those dynamics, didn't feel able to express his concerns because it didn't really seem like the committees were after thinking about the issues. It seemed like the committees were after rubber stamping Dr. Green's plan. And indeed, that is what happened. So many years later, after two journalists, Sandra Coney and Phillida Bunkle, published an article about what was happening under Dr. Green's care in the Metro magazine, these processes of deliberating about Dr. Green's plan looked entirely inadequate. And that is what the Cartwright inquiry, which was set up to investigate what had happened at National Women's, found. So the Cartwright inquiry came up with multiple recommendations. I'm not going to go through them all, but I just wanted to highlight two of those recommendations. So one of them was that the Director General of Health should monitor progress and encourage improvements in ethical committees by heightening the awareness of the importance of strong ethical principles in research and new treatment or management, and ensure that lay representation on the committee approximates 1/2 of the membership. So these were the findings that now Dame Sylvia Cartwright released in 1988. And it was in the shadow of those findings that the Health Research Council Act was passed. So that came into effect in 1990. And the Health Research Council Act essentially establishes the Health Research Council as the primary funder of health research in New Zealand, but it also establishes the Health Research Council Ethics Committee. And that is the committee that I am the current chair of. And that committee has a number of different functions that are laid out in the Act. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm just going to highlight two for our purposes. So the first function that's laid out in the Act is that we must ensure, in respect of each application that's submitted for a grant for the purposes of health research, an independent ethical assessment of the proposed health research made either by us as a committee or by a committee that we approve, and that we ought to give, in relation to ethics committees established by other bodies, advice on the membership of those committees and the procedures to be adopted. So in 1990, I was but a high school student, I have to confess. So I wasn't there at the inception. I've come into this party very, very late. By the time I reached this ethics committee, the way that these functions were being given effect to was established. So basically, our committee doesn't review any ethics proposals or funding applications ourselves. Instead, we focus on approving institutional ethics committees, the committees that are based in universities, and the health and disability ethics committees. And where our function is to give advice about membership of the committees and procedures and standards, well, really, we don't just set advice, we don't just give advice, we really set standards, and those standards are standards that we enforce through our approval mechanisms. So what I want us to think today, using how we operate as, I guess, a case, I want us to think about these fundamental questions. When we look to see whether an ethics committee is performing its job well, what are we holding it accountable for? What should we be looking for? What standards should we be applying? And how should we look to see whether those standards are actually met? And then I want us to think about my own committee. How should we be accountable for our review? And because at the moment, there isn't a formal mechanism for holding us accountable. We're a little bit like this ancient Greek assembly or the Supreme Court. We set standards, but we don't formally have anyone reviewing our own performance. And I have to say, that troubles me. That's not a power that I seek. So to give a little bit of context to ways in which bodies can be assessed for their fairness or their fitness, we can draw upon some established models. And the model that I propose that we think through is a model that philosophers James Sabin and Norman Daniels have proposed. And they call their model accountability for reasonableness. And the kind of genesis of this model really is recognition that when bodies are making decisions, for instance, about resource allocation, they are having to make decisions that are fundamentally contestable. There are competing accounts of distributive justice, and those accounts can reach very different decisions about whether a given funding decision is fair or not. There's no way that we can reconcile all these competing accounts. So if we're looking at decisions and deciding whether they're fair or not, we're going to end up in this kind of endless cycle of conflict between different substantive views of distributive justice. So what Sabin and Daniels suggest is in order to make progress and be able to make decisions that are subject to some assessments of fairness, let's not think so much about distributive justice. Let's think instead about procedural justice. What is a fair process by which a decision is made? And Sabin and Daniels say that if decisions like this that are inherently contestable can be made through a fair process, then they have legitimacy and they can be accepted as legitimate even by people who disagree with the substantive decision or the theory that underwrites that decision. I think we can take a similar approach to ethics decision-making because the decisions that ethics committees make, well, some of them are clear, just like decisions around distributive justice, actually. There are some decisions that are pretty clear, but there are another range of decisions that committees make that are inherently contestable. So a serious-minded committee could well make a decision that another serious-minded committee doesn't make about the same proposal. So we could take the same approach and think, instead of assessing whether a committee is doing a good job by looking at what decisions they make, we could look to see whether the processes that surround that decision making are fair. And if we're doing that, we could do worse than using Sabin and Daniels' model. So they identify 4 criteria for a procedurally just process. So the first is publicity. And what that means is that the workings of the committee need to be known about. They need to be transparent. And in particular, the grounds upon which decisions are made need to be made known. There has to be a level of public accountability in terms of the standards that the decision maker is applying. And those, the reasons that a decision is based upon, so the standards that a committee applies, they have to be clearly relevant to the decision being made. There has to be some process for appealing decisions and for a decision-making body to revise how it operates and revise its standards. And there has to be a mechanism of regulation. So there has to be some way in which the decision-making body is assessed to see whether they are adhering to these 3 criteria. So that's what Daniels and Sabin suggest. And that is more or less the approach that my committee takes. So we would see ourselves as contributing that regulatory function to a procedurally just process. And we assess, amongst other things, we assess a committee based upon these 3 criteria. I have to say, any model that's worth its salt is going to have come in for some criticism, and Norman Daniels and James Sabin's model is no exception there. So accountability for reasonableness has gaps. Some of you may have already identified this as I was speaking. And I think 2 of the gaps that I think require some attention are identified by Annette Ridd, and she observes that there's no requirement within Daniels and Sabin's model for consistency across decisions, but we generally think that consistency is a marker of a fair process. So that's something that we should have in mind. And they also don't speak to the question of representativeness. And this is really about the composition of the decision-making body. Who is on there? Whose voices and perspectives are represented? And I think this is a significant concern for ethics committees these days, and certainly something that my committee spends a lot of time reflecting about. So how do we do our job? Well, what we do is we firstly issue a requirements for us to approve an ethics committee. And we require ethics committees to submit an application for approval, which we assess. Once we have approved a committee, then we require them to submit annual reports to us and a 3-yearly reapproval application. And we review all of those reports that we receive against our requirements. What might happen once we've done that review? Well, we might seek clarification if we have questions from the committee. We might impose requirements. We might delay issuing an approval or accepting a report until certain conditions are met. We have tended to take, I think, a collegial, supportive approach, although I have to say there might be people here who disagree with that, but we try to work with committees, although we are coming to a point of making some stronger requirements, particularly in terms of representativeness on the committees. So, so we focus really on 3 areas. And the first is really on who gets to decide. So who is on an ethics committee exercising this power and responsibility. And our overarching requirement is that membership on the committee is composed of people who have appropriate expertise, skills, knowledge, and perspectives. And we also require a strong lay voice. And you can see that the roots of this requirement really go back to the Cartwright Review and the inquiry and the finding there that it was problematic, that it was only doctors who were making decisions, that there was really a need for a public perspective, because after all, these are decisions that affect the public. So we have in the past required there to be a lay chair on committees, but for many years, some of our committees have flouted that requirement and have given good reasons for doing that, because as many of you will know, the job of a busy institutional committee is no small matter. It can be almost a full-time job, certainly a bigger job that many people would feel comfortable leaving with a lay person wasn't getting paid for they may receive some kind of koha, but not a proper salary to do that role. And of course, once you do receive a salary, you're no longer lay. So there's that problem. So for a number of years, we have kept the requirement for a lay chair, but not actively enforce that requirement because we recognize the challenges there. So we have changed that requirement now to be one to have a strong lay voice. And I think that's something that would be good for us to discuss in plenary. How do we do that? How do we ensure that there is a strong lay voice on committees? We require a Māori member, and we have increased that to a requirement for 2 Māori members. And of course, that is a requirement that's grounded in Te Tiriti o Waitangi, our requirements as treaty partners for inclusion and for Māori to be able to exercise rangatiratanga, some form of sovereignty over matters that concern Māori. We have requirements for members who have an understanding of ethics and moral reasoning, law, the perspectives of wider community, expertise in scientific design, expertise in the health system and provision of health and disability services, and we have a requirement for a student rep. And I'm sure that none of that will surprise you very much. So we try to ensure that there is a properly constituted body who are making decisions. And then we focus on how the decisions are made. So we look at the processes for decision making. We look at the terms of reference, whether they're clear and appropriate, whether decision-making processes are sound. And so here we might be thinking about whether decisions are face-to-face, whether they're by Zoom, whether they're by email, whether that process permits full and comprehensive deliberation, shared deliberation. We think about who decides. So are all decisions going to the full committee? Are there subcommittees? What powers do the subcommittee have? Are there delegations to the chair? What would be delegated to the chair? And then we think about things like whether meetings are quorate, whether there is good attendance, whether there's full representation at meetings. And we look at the patterns of approvals. How many declines do you get? How many conditional approvals, for instance? And what might that suggest about the quality of review? But of course, what are we comparing this to? How do we know whether a pattern of approval suggests that review is being conducted appropriately? We also look at things like complaints and appeals procedures, and we're interested in what appeals and complaints have been received and how these have been dealt with. And that's something that we would often ask for more detail about from our committees. So we're looking at who makes the decisions, how the decisions are reached, and then we do think a little bit about the formal basis of decisions. So there we're thinking about those relevance criteria. So we might, for instance, review the ethics guidelines, because we don't require all ethics committees to operate the same guidelines. Universities generally have their own guidelines, and the HRECs use the National Ethics, the NEAC guidelines, the National Ethical Standards. So we review the guidelines to see whether they are comprehensive, whether they seem reasonable, whether they're clear, and we look at different elements of policy, like responsiveness to Māori, for instance, what your requirements are around pay, or restrictions are around paying participants. We look at cultural safety policies, compensation for harm, informed consent, etc. And we ask committees to tell us a little bit about how they manage some things that we know are difficult, like how do you manage reviews of research that's going to happen overseas? How do you manage reviews of research with vulnerable participants? And there, of course, we're making decisions. We're making decisions about whether the responses that we receive, the policies that we review, are reasonable. Not whether they're the policies that we would write, but whether they are reasonable. So there's a number of things that we don't do. We don't observe committees deliberating. We don't review committee decisions, except for when an appeal or a complaint is referred to us. We don't set committees tasks, for instance, and see how they perform in them. We don't talk to researchers or participants or committee members to see how satisfied they are with the policies. And these are all things that a committee like mine could do, and we don't do. And I'm kind of leaving it open for discussion. Are these things that we should be doing? And what would we be trying to get from it if we did those things? We also don't issue substantive ethics standards of our own. And so that kaupapa is informed by, I guess, a few foundational commitments. So firstly, our ethics committee thinks that ethical judgments are sensitive to context. So we can produce guidelines. Guidelines give a starting point for review, but of course they don't finish it. You know, the review starts by thinking about how guidelines might apply in this situation. So there's no way that ethics committees can get out of having to exercise their own judgment. And after all, they are the approving body, not us. We're not approving research. The committee is approving research. So approving is an act of responsibility, and it is an act of power. And we believe that it is for the committee to determine whether it's appropriate to approve a given piece of research, because it's their power that they're exercising, and they are the body that stands accountable for the decision that they make. So they have to believe in the decision that they make. So that's how we start thinking about our role. We're not trying to supersede ethics committees. We're trying to determine whether they are running fair and reasonable processes that allow their decisions to have legitimacy. But there are some significant implications of the way that we're running things. So one is that ethics committees that we approve will not necessarily, and nor are they required to, reach the same decision about a given application. And I know that you will know this is something that bothers researchers. So researchers often think, you know, well, I applied to Committee X last year with basically the same application, and that was approved. And now you guys are telling me that I can't do that. And so that inconsistency between committees is often taken by researchers to be a sign of failure. So to be a sign that one or other of committee has messed up in ethical stakes. I actually take a different view. I think that approvals are exercises of judgment, and judgment doesn't have to be the same between people for it to have validity. But I think that that's something that we should discuss. So the fact that committees might reach different decisions means that it can look like there's inconsistency across the sector, and probably it looks like there's a muddle to some people. Now, we also have committees that might reach decisions that members of my committee would disagree with. So the standards that our committee as individuals and maybe as our committee as a committee would reach are not necessarily the same as the standards of the committees that we approve. And I guess there's a question here. Is our role to impose our standards upon committees? I mean, surely there's one sense in which that is our role. So if we had a committee that didn't require informed consent for a proposal like Dr. Green's, the unfortunate experiment, I think that would fall below a threshold. But there'll be another range of questions where we allow research ethics committees to exercise their own judgment without trying to require anything there. And of course, membership and review processes are central to our examination of how committees operate. And that means that more and more we're requiring membership to be met, but we still have some questions about review procedures and how directive we should be. So just to kind of round off so we have some time for discussion, one question that occurs to me is how much the ethics committee like mine should require procedural consistency between committees, because actually we don't require that. We permit research committees to operate in quite different ways from each other. And an example might be low-risk research. So committees that we approve have really quite different ways of both conceptualizing what low-risk research is and managing it. Now, perhaps we should be regulating for greater consistency on process if process is the core of how we hold committees accountable. Another area would be the use of a chair's delegated authority. There are different practices between committees, and we don't try to make them all homogenous. Another question that I have, which would be good for us to discuss, is really the role of lay members. So the idea that lay members should have a significant say in decisions, that their input should be respected, is really important to the formation of ethics committees in New Zealand. But how are we to tell whether lay members do have a significant voice? Another question, one that troubles us, what should we do when committees do not fulfill all of our requirements? Should we strike them off? Should we work with them? Does it depend upon what requirements are not being met? And then that key thing, how should we be held accountable for our task? I guess on this point, I think I should cede the floor to the group. And I can see that there are some questions in the chat and in the Q&A. Gordon, how do you want to run this?
Well, there's one in the Q&A, so let's just start with that, Monique. But look, that's there's so much to unpack in that, and I think I made some comments earlier about the potential for a national association of HRECs potentially for reviews. So in a way that's kind of consistent. But I will say to everyone this afternoon, Rebecca Werter from Deakin Uni is going to talk about potential judicial review of HREC decisions. So I think that will be a really great talk to be at, Monique, and because it's sort of consistent with what you're saying, but one level up the chain, like who regulates the regulators, if you like. I suppose just to put it in summary, we have what's called a national approach to single ethical review, which is a system that was initiated during my time at the NHMRC, National Health and Medical Research Council, whereby the ethics review processes and support processes of a committee were assessed, and on the basis of that, around 50 committees were certified, such that, and they're mainly public health committees, such that approvals from them were able to be accepted across the board. It's not perfect. It doesn't really work because it's not national, for starters. Not every decision is accepted. For one reason, there are inconsistencies in membership, etc. So all the things you mentioned are really important. Now, I'm not going to ask any questions yet because there's way too many in the Q&A. So let me ask these for you. Mary Butler, the ethical issue is usually the one that is not visible. The most important thing about an approval body like the HREC is the pattern of who they choose to approve. For example, you mentioned universities, yet research has been going on at polytechnics in NZ for decades, now up to doctoral level, and my impression is that they operate within the context of DIY ethics committees that have not been approved by your committee, Monique. What is the cause of such an anomaly if it still exists? How could this be justified?
We do approve some polytechs, and as Mary might be aware, that the polytechs in New Zealand were amalgamated a couple of years ago, and we approved at least one of the polytechs that was joined there, and we still do, and they're working towards an ethics committee process that really encompasses the whole new organisation. But it takes time. I guess that the key thing that Mary raises there is not only about polytechs, but it's really, there is no legal requirement for ethics committees to be approved by us. It's voluntary. And the only requirement is that if that ethics committee is going to review HRC funded research, it has to be approved by us. But some committees might go, well, we won't review HRC funded research then. And for some universities or polytechs who may have researchers that do very little health research, that may be no hardship. But other organisations, particularly universities, want us to approve ethics committees that don't look at health research. So we have a number of institutions that, with multiple ethics committees, that divide the labour. So one does the health research, another does other things. And they want all of the committees approved because it provides that sense of that we are regulating, we are accountable. But we can't compel institutions to seek our approval. And I guess that's partly one of the factors that we consider when we work out how closely to monitor and require committees to meet all of our requirements at any given time, because this is essentially a voluntary system.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Monique. I mean, we have 200 and odd ethics committees, although now in WA, as I understand it, there is but one committee, so they have taken an option to reduce it to one. As I understand it, New Zealand has many fewer committees. And would that be correct? I thought you had about 8.
Yeah, we do. So we used to have more health and disability ethics committees, but maybe it was 10 or 12 years ago, the number was reduced to 4. So those are the Ministry of Health run committees that would do the, I guess, higher risk research, randomized controlled trials, more interventional stuff. And then there's the university committees that do look at some health research, but it would tend to be more qualitative or less risky research.
Yeah. And before I ask other questions, can I just ask, are your chairpersons paid for their roles?
So that's actually something that we've just collected some data about. So there are essentially meeting fees, and the meeting fees differ quite significantly between institutions, but the highest meeting fee I think that we've received notification of is $500, 500 New Zealand dollars for a meeting. So it's not going to keep you driving an Audi and with a batch in Omaha. but it's a koha, it's a recognition.
And then I won't go into the details of here, but interesting. And many years ago in the McKeon Review, proposed 8 professionalized ethics committees, largely for, I think, for medical research. Okay, Monica, I'm just going to carry on. Anonymous attendee, we agree we don't expect consistency of jury decisions, and therefore HREC decisions are similar. I really love that point, by the way. I think it's so important that the value of people's experience is brought to bear. Hudson, hi Hudson, the unfortunate experiment is still controversial.
Yeah, it surely is. It surely is. And there's big divisions between academics about to what extent Dr. Green was deviating from either scientific standards or the prevailing ethical standards when he did what he did. Yes,
and there's always this tension between clinical improvement and clinical research. And Lisa Eckstein, hi Lisa. Lisa, I think, is going to be talking possibly today about something or other, consent form improvements. I'd be interested to push a little more on whether your role could also extend to encompassing some element of merits review in terms of the quality of a decision. In Australian administrative law, we would think of this as a standard of reasonableness. That is, could any reasonable HREC have come to this decision? I think it's consistent with, I've often wondered why we don't do peer review of committees to consider how they do deliberate, because, as you know, some voices can be stronger than others. But in Lisa's point, what are your thoughts about Lisa's point there about?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, Lisa. And and I have wondered about this, how we would operate this. And as academics, we used to peer review. We rely on peer review. We send our work we solicit it because we want to know what we've missed. And so I'd be really interested to know whether committees are open to this and how it might work. And then I guess, the question is how you determine what you're looking for. Is it the decision that you would reach? Is it the decision that's most compliant with the guidelines of the institution? And how do we assess that? So I think it's something that we should definitely explore.
Okay, now Lisa, also having a second bite of the cherry, asks, I'd also be interested to know whether NZ has introduced shared ethical decision-making processes to allow HDECs to benchmark their decision-making against each other for feedback rather than accountability.
I don't know whether Nick Hagard is here, or somebody from the Secretariat who might be able to speak more to their internal processes. I mean, I know that the chairs of the HDECs meet and talk. What I'm not aware of is how formal that process is and the way that Lisa's talking about. Rob, I can see you have a hand up. Are you able to speak to this issue?
So no, Rob, I've just done. Rob is going to ask another question, but Rob, do you have a question for Monique?
No, I just had a comment about the issue of university and public health committees. I mean, in our area, a lot of our researchers have joint appointments at Sydney University and the Sydney Local Health District. And so when they're deciding which ethics committee they want to submit to, we have an agreement that the committee or the institution that has the duty of care for the participants is the one that does the ethics approval. So if they're students, the university does it. If they're patients, the hospital does it. And that works well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, because that allows the body with the duty of care essentially to perform the oversight, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Rob. Let's carry on, Monique. Exactly what information do you request in each annual report, and how is this used to evaluate the HREC? I will say that the NHMRC requires an annual report from HRECs here. It's pretty light on, quite frankly, and I'm not sure how you can use it to evaluate ethics committees, but I'm interested in your view.
Yeah, I mean, I've wrestled with this. So traditionally, the research, the information that we require, also a big part of when I'm reviewing a committee, I'm very interested in the membership, and I can see that there's a question about the membership. So we are looking for a range of expertise. We've got these categories, for instance, categories around expertise in scientific design, categories around Mātauranga Māori, tikanga, te reo, Māori member, and then we want to see a diverse range of community voices. We're not too dictatorial about which community voices. We want to see just some diversity, and we want to see some clinical membership. So we would look at we look at a short bio for each of the members, and we assess the committee as a whole. And we look at how many meetings have been had, how many decisions have been made, what the decisions are. So we're looking at patterns of decisions, and I can see that that is a useful thing, but I do feel unsure about what we're looking for, because there's no, you know, if there's a lot of declines, does that suggest a better committee than one that never declines anything? And that's something that committees differ about significantly. But that might track something different. It might track how much work goes in between the committee and applicants before things are submitted. It might track the riskiness of different, risk profiles at different institutions. It's very hard to know. So I have to say, sometimes I feel like I am reading the tea leaves rather than doing a more objective review. We have moved towards asking for more qualitative information from committees about the principles that they employ and giving some examples of that, but that doesn't have the comprehensive feel of numbers. So there's a bit of a qualitative, quantitative tension, which I haven't resolved in my mind.
Yeah, I think Monique and Louise has a question which actually is relevant to that, but I will point out that when I was chairing the Royal Brisbane Ethics Committee here, we had about 40 members. It didn't all turn up at once, but I would think most people online would agree that if you have the right expertise on your committee and even redundancy there, you probably get a better answer rather than if you just have the minimum number. Because after all, isn't it about the lived experience of everyone on the committee that brings those views to bear? And it is a good question that, Louise, you ask about how does the council ensure committees have the knowledge and expertise to review rapidly emerging clinical areas? You've got to have the expertise, otherwise how can you give a valid opinion?
Yeah, I think that this is really tricky, and we've been advocating for ethics committees to consult more about particular applications that they don't have in-house expertise in, because it's bound to happen, isn't it? It's bound to happen that things will come to your committee that you don't feel appraised of, and it's so easy to miss things. But my sense is that that is not an affordance that committees often utilise, actually, and I think it's something that we should do more and more.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I won't go into my own views because someone told me last year not to go into too many of my own views, so let's not do that.
What's the point of having all these views, Gordon, if you're not?
Well, you and I can talk about this offline, and I know that Lisa Eckstein and Rebecca McWhirter wish to talk offline as well, so that's good. How do you subsequently, Greg Kyle, how do you subsequently stop researchers developing their own league table of ethics committees that are easier to get a protocol approved by, and selectively submit their applications to those committees?
Yeah,
a very common question, Greg.
Yeah, I mean, I don't try to stop researchers doing that, but you hear that. Of course, you hear that. I mean, I know that I know that some committees are seen as being easier than other committees. I guess that comes to this issue of the fundamental contested nature of ethics. So some committees will place more importance upon supporting research. They'll see that as their primary requirement, and others will focus more on participant safety and maybe be more precautionary. And actually both I can see a place for both of those approaches. So yes, researchers will undoubtedly game the system or believe that they are. I don't think that that's for us to try to change. I think we have to accept that.
Yep, fair comment. Really good question here about equity in research. And we don't record the number of First Nations persons, or indeed other lived experience people that take part in research. And there are barriers, and one of our talks on Thursday is about exclusion in research, LGBTQIA plus exclusion research, which is really, I think it just will give us a great perspective. So we do face barriers, excuse me, in recruiting people from all appropriate backgrounds. What are the barriers in New Zealand, and how do you deal with it? Is this a role for the council in New Zealand?
Yes, that I was at the Australasian Association of Bioethics and Health Law Conference last week, and Ray Mahoney spoke about how deeply over-researched Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are in Australia, and some of the issues there. Over-researched, under-included, both things can be true at one time, can't they?
Yeah.
I know that the Health and Disability Ethics Committees here, so much of this is systems, isn't it? The overlap between our ethical obligations and the systems that we have to audit our ethical performance. They really have to go together. And so the issue that a lot of committees have here, I think, is that their systems don't allow them to collect information about this, to see. But the Health and Disability Ethics Committees have recently instituted that in their system. So they will be able to tell how many studies they approve, seek to recruit Māori. And I guess, then again, we're looking at, well, what should the numbers be? But at least if we have the numbers, we have a place to start from.
Yes, and it's a question, Monique, possibly of whether it's before the fact or after the fact, and is it for the committee to ensure that there is sufficient diversity in recruitment, or is it your role to look at it after the fact? And I would suggest it's probably better done beforehand. Just to make
sure. And I mean that raises another question that troubles me about committees' roles and variation. Some committees require researchers to submit a final report about their research, how it went, etc., etc. So you could use a report like that to derive information about recruitment, but others don't require that. And so again, we don't require committees to require that. We could, but we don't. How do we decide what to require and what not to require?
Cecily, so we'll just keep going for 3 more minutes, if that's all right, Monique. Too much interest. I'm going to try and get through as many as possible. Cecily Lander asks, first in human medication trials. In the highly sophisticated biological world of new potentially useful pharmaceutical agents and first in human trials, there is a need to ensure adequate, competent expertise versus a larger lay voice. Please comment.
Versus a larger lay voice. Well, I can see the point that Cecily is making. So there could be problems in the way that the trial is designed that a lay member might not pick up on. So you need expertise there. However, presumably, it's going to be lay people who are asked to participate in these studies. So experts don't have the monopoly on judgments about whether the risks are too high or the benefit risk profile of research is a reasonable one. That's something that lay members must be able to assess for themselves in order for participants to be able to assess that for themselves. So I see both things as being necessary. It shouldn't be one or the other. Both points of view have to exist. And I spoke with a member of a committee once. This is actually a colleague of mine, a well-known ethical theorist who'd been sitting on an ethics committee, and he talked to a few lay members who'd been there for years and years. And as they were chatting, it came to pass, they asked him, what an RCT is. So they'd been on this committee for years and no one had told them what an RCT is. And so that suggests to me a real problem with how lay members were included in deliberations in that committee, and that has to be avoided.
And I would also answer, Cecily, that in relation to those kinds of trials, there is, you know, an option for having a specific review committee for those scientific aspects of trials prior to going to an ethics committee. So that's another way of achieving that. Okay, Monique, Mike King from the Bioethics Centre asks or suggests the HRC Ethics Committee seems to have statutory functions, but no statutory powers. This seems not to be uncommon. Does this pose problems for your operation? If so, how do you work with it?
Does it? I guess in a way it doesn't pose a problem because we've never had those powers. So we've had to find ways to operate within what we have. So we have the power not to approve. And it seems that institutions want approval. So we can trade not on enforcement powers, but on the reputational interests that institutions have to be approved. So I guess it's a soft power. It's a power that relies upon the investment of institutions in being seen to be serious players in this area. If we had a rogue institute, we would have no power beyond our moral authority, such as it is, to respond to that. And that is probably a gap in the system, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I was really interested in your earlier comment about, you know, who regulates what you do, and you know, and the company directors, there's always a sort of governance where you have to report or be accountable to someone just to make sure there's oversight in the system. It's not perfect. What I do like is there's aspects of that would be really, you know, usable for Australia. You know, perhaps we're a bit one-dimensional, although, you know, we have one set of guidelines, you have more than one set of guidelines. I think we prefer one set of guidelines, quite frankly. But
yeah, I mean, I like one set of guidelines.
You know, the makeup of ethics committees here, we have 2 lay people. You can have more if you want, but you know, one of the questions or comments was about the voices provided by certain people, and we all know that if you have a strong voice in an ethics committee, it's really up to the chairperson to manage those individuals, and hence I was asking about whether chairpersons were paid. Let me finish, Monique, by just Angela Watt. Hi, Angela. Good to see you online. Down in Melbourne, when they mutual acceptance began back in 2010 or 11, I think all of the ethics committees worked together. No difference in final decisions, but differences sometimes in issues raised, but substantively no significant differences, and all HRECs were satisfied and felt heard and respected. It assured that all involved had a rigorous review that would be conducted, etc. And I think in the McKeon review, as I said, it was proposed that there should be 8 professionalised ethics committees in Australia. We in Australia have advanced health research and translation centres. You know, I often feel you should have 1 ethics committee per advanced health and research translation centre. You can have as many members as you want, but you know, like A, B, C, D, and E committees, for example. So I think Angela provides a good example of how committees can work together to, you know, come up with consistency. I think, just to summarise, Monique, you know, you've highlighted some great areas where we can learn. The inconsistency will always exist. I really like the point about not getting involved in the decision making, or at least recognising the autonomy of the individuals making the decisions. But I think we would all want to know that there was a, you know, high standard of ethics committee reviewing in Australia, and to that end, you know, perhaps it's time for there to be some more stringent oversight and requirements. So everyone.